actually, I just started to record the seminar. So it means that the session will be recorded and then it will be posted to our Jean Monnet chair website. Therefore, if this is mostly for the speakers or for the attendance online, if you do not wish to be recorded at the time that you want to contribute or to intervene, please just turn off your camera. On the other hand, if you have no objection to be recorded, we would ask you to turn on your camera if you just want to give a contribution or to take part in our session. So then that's all. I have already introduced our two speakers, and now we will start with our first presentation. First, before that, let me remind our students here in the classroom that you have a list that you have to sign. Okay, so Melanie, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and also for the kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. I will share my screen now. Very good.
Yes,
and start my presentation. So firstly, let me start with a few words on the European Environment Agency before I dive into the content. So the European Environment Agency is a decentralized agency of the EU. We operate at this interface between science and policy. So our mission is to provide sound and independent information to policymakers and to the public. So we are located in Copenhagen and we are rather small. So we are 230 staff members. We work together with our 38 member countries and cooperating countries in the so-called IONET network, the European Environment Information and Observation Network. And this partnership network brings together 1,800 experts from over 400 national institutions. And this is the knowledge base that we can tap into when for our environmental data and assessments that we work with. So I have divided this presentation in three parts. First, a little bit on the EU policy for the framing and the context of the EA's work on climate change mitigation, and then a part on how the EEA is supporting this EEA climate policy, and a part on our flagship report, Trends and Projections in Europe, where I will look a little bit more into the results. This is just a slide that I think you will know everything that's on there, but I just want to frame a little bit the whole context, give you an overview of how the EU climate and energy targets developed over the years. So the illustration shows the climate and energy targets for 2020, 2030, and 2050. And I will briefly walk you through these targets to put these latest agreements in the European climate law in the broader context. So the three interrelated EU headline targets for 2020 were adopted as the EU climate and energy package back then in 2007. And these targets were to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 20% compared to 1990 levels. So we always use 1990 as our reference year. And the second target was to achieve a 20% share of renewable energy sources in the overall energy use, and to achieve a 20% improvement in the EU's energy efficiency compared with projections for 2020. In 2015 then, when the EU ratified the Paris Agreement, it adopted EU-wide targets for 2030. And it was again the three areas to reduce the domestic greenhouse gas emissions by at least 40% compared to 1990, to increase the share of renewables to at least 32% of the EU's gross final energy consumption, and to achieve at least 32.5% improvement in the energy efficiency compared to the Commission's baseline scenario. And for the longer term perspective, for 2050, the objective was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80 to 95% below 1990 levels. And this was endorsed by the European Council in 2009. Now, in 2019, when Ursula von der Leyen became the president of the European Commission, she presented the European Green Deal. And in it, the ambition for Europe to become the first climate neutral continent. And it's maybe also important to note that these EU internal targets were always aligned with the EU pledges for international commitments under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. So the internal targets were always consistent with the international targets. So, and now we are in a position where we shift our game. The European climate law now sets this climate neutrality target for 2050 that was endorsed in the European Green Deal into binding legislation. And this was a major achievement in the negotiations that led to the adoption of the European climate law. And this only happened last year. So the climate law also sets in legislation a higher ambition for 2030 with a net emission target of minus 55% by 2030, and again compared to 1990. And net emissions means here that the removals of emissions are included, for example, from land use change and forestry. So to ensure, though, with this inclusion of this land use sector and the removals of emissions, to ensure that we still first and foremost achieve our target with emission reductions, the removals can only contribute to achieving to the net zero emissions to a certain extent. So there is a limitation there. However, in general, of course, we want to achieve the highest volume of carbon net sink by 2030 in Europe. But to achieve our target, the cap is limited. Now, in order to deliver on the European Green Deal and to achieve the targets stipulated now in legislation in the European climate law, the European Commission proposed legislative proposals, a raft of proposals that you are well aware. It runs under the name Fit for 55 package. So this is the net of all the different proposals and what areas they cover. And we at the EA, we work on almost all of these little mosaic areas. And the proposals cover climate, they cover energy, they cover transport, and also taxation. And I would like to mention a few of the key elements. I'm not going very much in depth, but just to give you a little bit of an overview what the different elements of these legislative proposals are. Now, I would like to mention the EU ETS and the effort sharing regulation and the LULUCF regulation, land use change in forestry and agriculture. So the ETS, basically, you are probably well aware, is an instrument to put a price on carbon. So the energy intensive industries and power generation and aviation need carbon credits for every ton of carbon they emit. And some are auctioned, some are freely allocated. And carbon credits can then be traded, and the overall amount of carbon credits is reduced over time. It exists since 2005, and it led to impressive emission reductions in the power generation sector over time, since then, in the last 15 years. And in the policy proposal now, we see that the cap for emissions will be reduced every year and will be more stringent. So this is, I think the everything in a bottom line. And there is also a discussion to cover, to extend the ETS and also include the building and the transport sector in an adjacent, separate ETS scheme. Then we have the effort sharing legislation. Currently, we have effort sharing decision in place, which will be an effort sharing regulation in the future. It's also in place since 2005, and it covers the sectors that are not covered by the ETS, like transport, building, agriculture, waste, and small industry. But as I said, there are discussions at the moment that transport and building should also be included in the ETS. The main element in the ESR is that it sets national targets and target trajectories from 2021 to 2030 for every member state and every year to ensure that it's an incremental improvement over time. And then there is the LULUCF, where we also have a revision that should ensure that the emission sink will be growing and be more sustainable. Now, the second on my second slide that shows the key elements here, I have policy proposals that are targeting the most problematic emission source sector, and that's the transport sector. So the Commission suggests there stronger CO2 emission standards for cars and vans, including a zero emission target for newly registered cars as of 2035. And it wants to promote the alternative fuel charging infrastructure to facilitate the target, because it's like a systemic transition. You need a target for the cars, but you also need the infrastructure, of course, to enforce the implementation. Then there is a bundle of legislative proposals that relate to energy and taxation, and there we include a more stringent target for renewable energy, and that's about 40%, where we have the so-called renovation wave to promote energy efficiency in buildings. We have energy taxation that is in line with this climate and energy policy, and there is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And as you know, to discourage carbon leakage that contribute to a global emission decline, and not only in Europe. So this was just to dive a little bit into what is discussed at the moment. It's still the proposal stage. And now I would like to say something. What is the EA's role in this policy context? What do we do? And as I mentioned earlier, our mandate is to provide relevant and timely information to policymakers and the public. So we prepare data sets and assessments that serve, for example, the development of policy proposals, or we also monitor the progress of implementation of policies, so on the other side of the spectrum. And regarding climate change mitigation, the agencies, for example, we are the official and recognized source of data on historic greenhouse gas emissions. So if I show you a few examples of what we do, in the climate mitigation, energy and transport group at the agency where I sit, we monitor and quality check and compile data sets, a lot of data sets. So normally this data is reported to us by EU member states, and the monitoring and reporting procedures are normally set into EU legislation, and we heavily support the Commission in preparing many such greenhouse gas data sets, for example, greenhouse gas inventories, so that's the historic data, greenhouse gas projections, policies and measure databases, F-gas emission, CO2 emissions for cars and vans, and approximated inventories to have an early estimate on the historic inventory data. And on the right, you see some news items from the EA's website, some recent news items. And this is to give you a glimpse in what you would find maybe for your work on the EA website. Now, I was saying that we do data and assessments, and on the assessment side, We assess the progress of the EU and the member states towards the climate and energy targets, for example. We analyze greenhouse gas emission trends for various sectors and policy areas, such as the ETS and renewable energy. We also look into cross-cutting topics, such as the links of climate and circular economy, and the links of climate and digitalization, for example. So here are just some of the web news items of the climate change mitigation area of the EA website that relate to these type of assessments that we do. And this is just a list that I thought could be interesting in the context of this event, that we have another important vehicle to provide condensed information to policymakers, and that are the EEA indicators. And I've listed here the indicators that are most relevant for the elements of the Fit for 55 package that I just mentioned before. And I added the hyperlinks to the slide. So when you receive the slides later on, that you also can find the different indicator assessments. And these indicator assessments form an important basis for this annual flagship report that we do in the Climate Change Mitigation Unit, and that's the annual Trends and Projections report. And I will now go a little bit more into that. So the Trends and Projections report is a report that we do on an annual basis, and we look into the progress of the EU's and the member states towards reaching the climate and energy targets. And the report is multi-dimensional, and that means that we look into greenhouse gas reduction targets, the renewable targets, and the energy efficiency improvements. We look into the historic data, but also in the projections. We look into the short-term, mid-term, and long-term target achievements. And the geographical scope is the EU 27, sometimes also with the UK when we look into past data. And we also look into other so-called cooperating EEA member countries, such as Switzerland, Luxembourg, Iceland, and Norway. And if we have a look here, this is a visualization that summarizes the EU member states' progress towards their targets for 2020 at national level. So this assessment is based on preliminary data for 2020. It's the latest data we have available. So now it's 2022, but the latest greenhouse gas inventory data available is always 1.5 years old, because it takes time to collect the data, to do the reporting and the quality checks, and then the final data set is only available 1.5 years after. And at the moment we are working on the new data set. So this last report was published in October last year, and we're now working on the next one. So let's have a closer look. As I said, on a national level, when we look into greenhouse gases, we look into the ESD, the effort sharing decision targets that are annual targets. And in this case, we look into the 2020 targets. And we have here 21 countries with a blue top of the pyramid, which shows that these countries achieved their annual effort sharing target under for 2020. And the ones with the red top have not achieved the target. And overall, the overachievement of several countries make up for the lack of achievement in others, which means that the EU as a whole is reaching the 2020 target, regardless if some of the countries do not. For the renewables, this is the middle triangle in this pyramid. We have 22 countries meeting the target. And for energy efficiency, we have 2 targets, one for primary and one for final energy consumption. And the primary energy consumption target was achieved by 20 countries, and it was also 20 countries for the final energy consumption. So if we shift now more to the EU level and to the overall trend, here I am starting again with the greenhouse gas emissions, and then I will go to the renewable energy and the energy efficiency again. So if we look at the greenhouse gas emissions here, this is the EU's greenhouse gas emission trend from 1990 to 2035. For the 2020 target, we look at emissions excluding LULUCF. LULUCF, so the land use, the removals, the emission removals, because this was the scope of the 2020 target. And for 2030, we look into the same data, including LULUCF. And this is why you have here this double line and not only one. The upper line is the one without LULUCF, and the lower line is the one with LULUCF. So the 20% reduction target for 2020 was met. It was overachieved, and the emission between 1990 and 2020 decreased by 31%. And as you can see very clearly here, we have a dip, a very clear dip that was related to the measures of the pandemic, where we had a huge emission reduction in 2019 and 2020. Now, the -55 net emission target for 2030 and the net zero emission target for 2050 will not be reached according to current projections. So you see that the current projections are the dotted lines here. And these lines are way above the 2030 targets, and they're not quite leading to the 2050 target. But you see also that the two gray boxes show this very nicely. Between 1990 and 2020, we saw an average annual emission reduction. So every year we reduced our emissions on average by 53 million tons. And in order to reach the -55 target by 2030, we will need to reduce our emissions by 137 million tons on average year on year. And this is like 2.5 times as much. So you see already that the ambition to reach the 2030 and 2050 target really needs a gear shift in the ambition of our policies that are at the moment in place. And this is where the Fit for 55 comes in, because these dotted projections do not yet include the Fit for 55 instruments. So the idea is that the proposed Fit for 55 package will bridge this gap, and that the next projections that include these new policies and the effects of these new measures that will be hopefully agreed now will be closer to the 2030 target. And as you see here, the 2030 target then nicely leads also to 2050 in an incremental way, in a sensible slope. So it is possible, in our view, to make this to reach these targets, but it needs this new policy package to deliver. Now, when we look a little bit more into the sectoral perspective, there you see in the middle we have the shares. So in this donut chart, you see the shares of the different sectors in the total greenhouse gas emissions, and in the horizontal bars, you see the greenhouse gas emissions in the different years, starting with 2005. And the highest reductions are observed in the energy supply sector, where the emissions decreased by 43% between 2005 and 2020. And the blue bars, as I said here, show nicely this reduction from the first bar to the third bar. And the energy supply sector is also the largest source sector that you can see here in the donut chart. Considerably greater efforts are needed in the transport and agriculture sector, where it is also important to say that that while the energy supply is widely covered by the EU ETS system, the transport agriculture are addressed by national targets, and they are therefore require further implementation of measures at the national level. So now I will move to the renewable energy part, the renewable energy dimension, where we have preliminary data for 2020 that shows that we have a total share of renewable energy of 21.3%. And that means that our 2020 target of 20% is achieved. But we should mention that part of this achievement is, of course, also related to the decreasing energy consumption, and not so the share increased, but also because the energy consumption decreased, and not only because the deployment of renewable energy increased. So the greatest shares of renewable energy were observed in the electricity consumption, and to a more limited extent in heating and cooling, not so much in transport. And I also have here this overview where we look into how much we grew our total renewable energy share in the past, and that's on average 0.7% per year, and how much we would need to reach the 2030 target, here 32% renewable energy share, and that would be 1.1% from 2020 onwards. The 32% renewable energy target that you see depicted here is still relating to the 2030 target, to the 30% 2030 target, because the new proposed 40% renewable share is still under discussion. And as a rule in our publications, we use only what's currently agreed in the legislation. The basis is the current legislation. And when things are still in the proposal stage, we discuss it, but we don't use it in our assessments. Now, lastly, I would like to show you the results in the energy efficiency dimension and an outlook to the 2020 targets. The 2020 target was, in previous years, it was really uncertain if we would meet these targets. It was often a very diverging trend. However, now with this preliminary data for 2020, we have a reduction that is caused by the measures of the COVID pandemic, and therefore we will meet our primary and final energy consumption target at the EU level. In fact, we will overachieve it, but this is really only due to the drop in 2020. In order to reach the current 2030 targets, we will need to maintain and considerably intensify our energy efficiency efforts. The proposal for more ambitious 2030 energy efficiency targets is as in the renewable energy, will be 36% for final and 39% for primary energy consumption, instead of the 32.5% that we had for the current 2030 targets. So this is almost everything I wanted to show you. I just would like to give you another glimpse into our publication package from last October, where we published this trends and projections report, and this additional data sets that are used in the trends and projections report, and also this indicator list that I showed you. And we also created a very nice new climate and energy platform, where I also included the links, and the links should be working on the PDF as well. And here we have a massive amount of nice data visualizations that show, that give a little bit more insight in our data. So that's everything from my side, and I am looking forward to any questions you might have. Thank you so much. I think I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Melanie. I'm sure that there will be some questions and some comments. We can just select that on the second part of the debate, if that works with you too. So yeah, because I think there are some of the data that you show us on the tracking, the national emissions and everything, which is I think curious, at least that may bring some questions too. So let's just move now to our next presentation, which is a presentation, excuse me, of Professor Teresa Fajardo about well, climate change policy from the external action of the European Union and conditionality. So Teresa, whenever you want, if you want to share the screen or whatever, you are Teresa, you are mute.
No.
No, yes.
Thank you, Mara. And I won't use any PowerPoint. So I'm going to talk about the climate diplomacy and the conditionality, and I will just make a presentation with the main points that I consider that I will discuss maybe later with the students. So if I might say that, like as Melanie just said in her presentation, the European Union has always been consistent with the internal target and the external targets. And this is quite important if we keep it in mind, this idea of consistency between the internal policies and the external policy of the European Union. And in this particular case, when we talk about climate diplomacy and climate conditionality, it's important to take into account that this is one major issue. If we think about the Green Deal that was adopted in 2019, that was the big, I mean, it was the big ambition of the European Union and the Ursula von der Leyen. It was the roadmap for our transition to a decarbonized economy. This Green Deal has different pillars, and as you might know, the pillar of fighting climate change, and then the pillar of digitalization. And definitely there will be a third pillar, which will be the social cohesion. And this is maybe more important now than ever, because last week, the European institutions, they were discussing again one of the almost maybe the final draft for the 8th environmental program of the European Union. And for me, was very important just to remark something that was added by the European Parliament. The European Parliament said that if we want to mainstream, to integrate environmental protection, the fight against climate change, the fight against biodiversity loss, in all the different policies, we will have to take into account the social cost. And this is very important for the European Union, and it's very important if we consider this message that we are saying very, very clear, that we are willing to accept the social cost. And something else, because it was very, very clear said by the European Parliament that achieving this process of mainstreaming climate change, biodiversity in the different policies will mean very important commitments in the field of transport, agriculture, energy. So at least we can say that we have made a very ambitious roadmap to this decarbonized new model of economy. the thing that for me is quite interesting and might be maybe the most important thing that I'm going to talk about this afternoon is the idea that the European Commission has said very clearly that fighting against climate change is the defining task of our generation. And because it's important for the survival of the planet, and because it's important for all of us to try to reach this important goal of decarbonizing our economy, as the Melanie has presented with different targets. But the important thing is, when the Green Deal was presented, there is something that we have to have very, very clear in our minds. It's the idea that in order to reach and to achieve these internal goals, we have to try to reach them as well as at the external dimension. We need to turn our regional goals into global goals. And this is one of the priorities for the European Union to achieve in the United Nations different conferences and fora. So for the European Union to try to achieve the external dimension of the Green Deal means that we will have to turn this Green Deal in a global Green Deal. This is consistent with our tradition. The European Union has tried to be a normative power in the field of the environmental protections for some decades. At the beginning, we have to accept the proposals coming from the United Nations because the international environmental law had a seminal effect in the European Union environmental policies. So we accepted at the beginning that the international environmental law has a very important role in the inception of the European Union environmental law. But starting in 1992, we started to promote our positions at the European Union level. It means that we became committed with the idea of the United Nations multilateralism. So promoting projects in the European, in the United Nations, together with the member states. And at the beginning, we were working with what was called the Green Diplomacy Network, the different external services of the member states. And afterwards, this Green Diplomacy Network was incorporated in the European Union system thanks to the external action service of the European Union. So at some point, the European Union with its member states and with the external action service became a very important actor in the United Nations fora, trying to speak with a unique voice and at the same time having the same agenda, and in terms of diplomacy, developing the same démarche. So if we remember this term, démarche, which is the classic word in diplomacy to talk about the initiatives that are developed by state, in this case, the European Union, before the United Nations in order to achieve a policy or a proposal. The most successful démarche that has been achieved by the European Union is absolutely the Paris Agreement on climate change. And this is, I suppose, something that we are aware of. So the Paris Agreement on climate change is the result of a very long process of supporting the idea of agreeing on a binding instrument in order to accept more commitments regarding the fight against climate change. So if we think about climate diplomacy, we have to say that is at least one of the most relevant diplomacies of the European Union, and it's related with the idea of multilateralism trying to defend the adoptions of common norms and standards and a same regulatory framework for all states. And most important, and this is something that is one idea that I would like at least to highlight, the idea that fighting climate change means that we are developing global policies in the United Nations, in the Glasgow conference that took place last year. But at the end of the day, all the measures should have to be taken by states at the national level. And this is something very important. This is why Melanie was mentioning the targets adopted at the national level. And this is why I'm going just to add that all individuals, companies, farmers, all of us, we have to be involved in this process of fighting with against climate change. So this idea of incorporating in our national legal orders the goals that have to be achieved and that we committed to in the case of the Paris agreements and in the different conference of the parties that upgraded our commitments. This is very important because at the same time, these targets that we are adopting at the national level and the European Union level, these are targets that might or requires to be adopted by the rest of the states in the world, because if not, we have to confront this idea of unfair competition. And this problem that Melanie mentioned regarding the carbon leakage, which means that we will have to face the delocalization of European companies that will try to benefit from the low regulatory systems in other countries. And that, and this is very, very important for us. The idea that the carbon leakage puts the European Union in a position that is very, very important, and that is going to be one of the most important challenges for next decades. I mean, carbon leakage means delocalization, but at the same time, it means that in our market, we will be receiving goods coming from third countries that won't incorporate in their prices their footprint. So it means that the mechanisms of adjustment in the borders that will introduce a tax, or it will incorporate some sort of adjustment in order to take into account the cost that requires to be reflected in the final price regarding their impact in the climate change because of their methods and process of production, and as well the use of fossil fuels, in order at least to balance this unfair competition between their countries' goods and the goods that are produced in the European Union. So in order to promote this idea that at the global level, we need the same level playing field, which is at the end of the day what we are trying to look forward. I mean, this regulatory framework is based in the Paris Agreement, in the different commitments that we adopted. But the European Union, as we said at the beginning, tries to be a normative power at the international level. To do so, we try to lead by example. So it means that we will try to show that we are able to comply with our commitments at the internal level, that we will reach the targets as Melanie mentioned, even though there will be problems on the way to do it. But the other idea is that in order to comply with these targets and to try to promote our positions and our goals at the global level, we used this idea of conditionality. So the conditionality is the EU's way of defending our values, our interests, our goals using the instruments of power that we have at our disposal. So it implies that third countries with which the European Union and its member states are going to conclude agreements like accession agreements, pre-accession agreements, trade agreements, association agreements, all of them, if they want to negotiate with us all this very wide range of agreements, they will have to accept a series of conditions. So if you think about our external action, these conditions cover everything from the rule of law and democracy and human rights, and then the environment and climate change. So this is something that for me is important and that has become very, very central in the external action of the European Union. The idea that the fight against climate change is part of the conditionality policy of the European Union. So it means that we have incorporated chapters on sustainability and climate change in all the agreements that we have been negotiating in the past decade. So ever since the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, ever since the Paris Agreement was adopted, the European Union has tried to promote that third countries adhere to them and comply with them and comply with their national commitments in, helping them to comply with their obligations on the field of mitigation and adaptation. So it means that there are different instruments that will pay, we will fund these different national projects in order to comply with mitigation and adaptation obligations. So this is something important, but at the same time, it requires a wider scenario that I would like to describe you. The European Union, as a normative power, as I said, we try to lead by example, showing that things, the objectives of the Paris Agreement can be achieved at the European Union level, but it's not enough in order to reverse the process of climate change. And the reason why the European Union has to go further is because the global scenario has changed very much in the last decades. So the European Union and the member states might fight against climate change, and we might adopt our commitments and to honor them. The problem is that in the case of the climate change, the solution to the problem seemed to be outside our reach. And the reason is because we say that in the case of the environmental problems, to be part of the solution, we have to be part of the problem. And the situation is that the European Union was responsible of at least 20% of the emissions in the 90s, but not anymore. So if we take a look at the figures related to the global emissions, we have to see and to accept that the European Union as member states now, we are only responsible of maybe 60%, 80% of the global emissions, although in real terms, the figure is higher because we need to ask the emissions from freight transport or those resulting from the delocalization of European companies to third countries that do not comply with the commitments made in the Paris Agreement. On the other hand, China is now responsible for 28% of the total emissions, the United States of America of 15%, and India already exceeds the Europe emissions with a 7% of the emissions. So it means that if we are only responsible of the 6% of the emissions, we might be only capable of dealing with this solution in a very small proportion. We are limited because of this situation. So in order to go further, we are willing to accept that we are going to comply with the principle of the common responsibilities that we have with all countries in the world. And we are going to try to help those third countries that are suffering the most because of the climate change impact. So, and this is important because there is something that, again, using the figures to give you a better view of the scenario. In the case of Africa, the countries of Africa, they are only responsible for 4% of the total emissions. So the continent that is most affected by the climate change is only responsible for 4% of the emission. So when the members of the G20, all the developed countries, they account for a total of 74%. So at the end, only these developed countries that are the state that have the solution to the global problem within their reach. So those countries, the developing countries, they have no possibility to reverse the process. Even though they are suffering the biggest climate extreme weather events. The last week there was this mention in the newspapers just talking about these mega cities in the India with 4 million people living there, for example, Mumbai, and being affected by the high level of the seas that will wipe out part of the coast, and that will force that some million people will have to change their homes. I mean, this is something that is already happening, but sometimes we need some figures. And the situation in Africa, in areas, for example, in Senegal, with the rising, the rising of the seas, and this rising of the seas that is threatening as well the existence of the Pacific countries. So this is an example just to show how the most affected states can do nothing to combat a problem that they have not helped it to create. So with this situation, with this phenomenon, with geopolitical consequences that can trigger major problems like migratory movements, internal conflicts that can be internationalized. With this situation that is related with risk and threats at regional and global level, the European Union has tried to send a message in different fora, as I said. For example, when we think about the climate change as a threat, the European Union was one of the members of the group that presented before the Security Council in 2007 this idea of adopting a resolution on fighting climate change in order to address the worst adverse effects. In the case of the other aspects of the external action of the European Union, and when we think about the toolbox that the European Union has, the different policies, at least I would like to mention some of these ideas. So the idea is that the European Union participates in the United Nations different conferences. In the case of the Framework Convention of the United Nations on climate change, and in the different agreements and protocols that have been adopted afterwards, the European Union has always defended the United Nations position. So we have we have aligned, as Melanie said, we have aligned our targets, our internal targets, with the targets of multilateralism. However, and this is something that is important to say, at some point, the European Union considered that we have to go further. sometimes multilateralism is not enough to achieve the desired results. And at some point, the European Union started to question the fundamental aspects of multilateralism, and we thought about renewing some of our instruments in order to take into account more stronger measures. In particular, when we think about the trade and partnership agreements, we started to incorporate chapters that establish as one of the conditions, as I said before, the compliance with the Paris Agreement on climate change by these third countries. At the same time, we try to promote a regulatory framework to be adopted by these third countries. And this is very relevant because, for example, in the case of the agreement with the United Kingdom after Brexit, it was a major issue because the United Kingdom left the European Union because they were against the regulatory framework that the European Union imposed to them from their point of view. But at the end of the day, what they have done has been to incorporate in this agreement the regulatory framework of the European Union regarding climate. But not just that, the United Kingdom, once they have left the European Union, they are replicating the same agreements that the European Union has adopted. So it means that the United Kingdom is now negotiating with their countries agreements that follow the same patterns, the same model as the European Union. If we think about the other major trade and association agreements, the European Union has introduced the climate change. And I will like, at least I was thinking, yes, we have done it in the case of, if we think about the bilateral agreements with Vietnam, Japan, Canada, South Korea, we have introduced this idea of these chapters that highlight this common fight against climate change. But sometimes there are inconsistencies. And I would like to give you, again, an example. In the case of the Mercosur agreement, now, again, the negotiations are being stalled for a while because the situation was quite controversial, like in many other situations in which the negotiations were quite secret. They were negotiated behind closed doors for almost 7 years. And at the end of the day, what happens, and it happened the same thing with Canada, there was a leakage of the information regarding the final draft to be adopted. And when we consider some of the aspects of this Mercosur agreement, we have to consider that we are introducing clauses to fight against climate change, but at the same time, we are buying soya, we are buying meat coming from those countries, which means that they're going to have to change the use of land in the countries, increasing their emissions, increasing their capacity to fight against climate change because of the measures that they will have to do that will imply in many occasions deforestation. And the responsibility at the end of the day will be, should be shared with us. And in some cases, we should accept the responsibility of being those that trigger those processes of deforestation in countries like those with, we maintain this trade relations. Another case, and this is interesting, is the case of our agreement with China. And this is, I mean, this is one peculiar case because the comprehensive agreement on investments that we negotiated for years with China that finally was suspended because of the violation of human rights against the minority Uyghur in China. meant that we stop the process of adopting this comprehensive agreement on investments, but at the same time, at least we agree in some priorities in the negotiation. For China, it has never been the goal to accept binding agreements. For China, the most important thing is to keep the negotiations open, and this is something that they have achieved somehow, because the bilateral agreements that China has with many member states of the European Union, they are still in force, and it will give China and the European Union time to go on progressing with the negotiations. And again, in this particular case, we have established the same level playing field, a basic regulatory framework that is very important to keep in mind. So this is very important, at least to, yes, to highlight this idea that we have instrumentalized some of our trade agreements, association agreements, in order to fight for some of our values and interests, and in this particular case, to fight against climate change. So climate conditionality is closely linked to the new economic model proposed by the Green Deal. So for us, it's quite important just to keep in mind that it's very close to the trade strategy that we are defending vis-a-vis our major trading partners, the United States of America and China. So the situation, for me, this is something that I wanted to share with you. This global Green Deal that we want to achieve at the global level comes at a cost. And I think this is something that, again, for me is important. We need to introduce, we need to integrate our major priorities in the different policies. And this is not so easy. So in order to be socially just and compliant with our pledge that we won't left anyone behind, so it means that we need to go further in our commitments regarding our cooperation to development policies. So this is something that is going on, and this is very important because it means that we have incorporated many changes in our cooperation to development policy. And for example, if we think about the new negotiations that started 1 month ago with the African countries, this is one of the main issues and one of the main priorities. The other idea, and I'm going just to finish with this, presenting maybe what might be the most ambitious change that has taken place in the last months, is the global gateway. In the month of December 2021, the European Commission and the High Representative presented this proposal that is the European Union way to compete with China and its Belt and Road Initiative. So for me, it's interesting just to highlight the phrase that opens this communication that says, democracies and the values that underpin them must demonstrate their ability to deliver on today's global challenges. They must have the capacity and the ambition needed to help improve people's life around the world. This reality is brought into sharp focus by the ever-growing necessity for countries to invest and develop the infrastructure they need to create sustainable prosperity, jobs, and services for their local communities. So this is the idea, the main idea that inspires our global gateway. And this is our answer to what has been called by the United Nations an investment deficit. So we are going to provide funds we are talking about 300 billions of euros. 300, yes, billions of euros in the period 2021-2027. But given the current war in Ukraine and the situation that has been provoked, that has an impact at the global level, these initiatives might be prorogated for a longer period. So the Global Gateway will invest in international stability and cooperation to demonstrate that democracies can make a change in the global system, and that democracy can offer a roadmap, a different roadmap to investors. So introducing sustainability, human rights, democracy, the rule of law. And this is something that it has been incorporated in the different principles that will inspire the investment policy of this global gateway. The initiatives that will be funded by this global gateway fund and resources will have to address six values or principles. So the protection of democratic values and high standards, the idea of good governance and transparency, equal partnerships, green and clean cooperation, and then security-focused infrastructure, and the main point, catalyzing private sector investment. And this is maybe the most important thing, because the climate change fight, the fight against climate change can only be won if we share our pledge, our commitment with the private sector. And this is something that the European Union is trying to promote in third countries, in developing countries. So again, this investment strategy that we are promoting in third countries, in developing countries, mostly in Africa. And this is sad to say, because Latin America has a very low profile in this negotiation. The idea is that we are going to mobilize this 300 billion euros in investments in the digital sector, climate and energy, transport, health, education, and research. And this is very important, because we are going further that the competencies foreseen in the treaties provide. So our ambition is very, very high. We want to invest in these countries in order to try to reach together this transition to a new model of economy. So we will see what happens, considering that the Ukraine war is going to make us face some of our more important challenges regarding this transition to the decarbonized economy. You know now that the situation is very difficult, because in Spain we have had a strike from the transport sector, and this is something that we try to isolate, and we don't think about the wider scenario in which this situation, the very high prices that we have to pay for the gas and all the oil that came from Russia, but as well from other countries like Algeria, and the situation with Morocco. We really need to take into account this bigger picture, this bigger scenario, and we will have to renew our commitments for the next years. Thank you very much for your attention, and if you want to go a little bit further with one of these issues, I will be more than happy to go on to talk about that. Thank you.
Sorry. Okay. No, it's not.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry. Excuse me. I was just trying to get at some time my iPhone so we can also see each other, but I think it doesn't work with the iPhone and with the computer altogether. So thank you, Professor Fajardo, for your passionate and clear and interesting presentation. So let's now just start our debate. And I would like now to share the screen. Let's see. Sorry. Okay. So I will just invite anybody, of course, in the classroom and those who are online to, to ask for the floor using the hand raised somewhere. I think we have a question on the chat. Okay, there is a question for Mrs. Spoorer. I don't know if you can read it, but if not, I can do it for you. First of all, thank you. Thank you for your talk. I would like to ask you about the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by transport item. Yesterday, the Superior Court of Justice of Catalonia annulled the low emissions zone of Barcelona due to concerns over proportionality of the measure and some irregularities of the procedure of enacting it. What is the position of the European Environmental Agency on urban mobility? Does the agency prefer a prohibition-based approach, like the low emission zone, or a tax toll-based approach, like the congestion taxes on Stockholm? Thank you. So this is the first question for Professor Spoorer. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this question and for mentioning also this local aspect. That's very interesting. So in general, I would think that it's always a mixture of measures that will, a mixture of coherent measures that will achieve the reduction target, and any changes or any measures will affect or touch upon many different interests. So it's also the local circumstances that will determine which of the measures is more appropriate than the other. And it's not that the agency has a certain preference in which measures work better than others, because I think it's very much circumstantial, and especially in this urban mobility, it's very much depending on the urban city circumstances. So I couldn't say if a prohibition-based approach or a tax toll-based approach is the better approach in that sense. But I'm actually looking into if we have some recent assessment on that, and I'll try to send you in the chat a report if I find something that exactly focuses on this aspect.
Well, thank you very much. That would be great. I don't know if there is any question here in the classroom. I think they are a little bit shy. There is a question. So we have also another question from Diego Sanchez on the virtual room, but let's first, I will ask you to speak loud and clear, because it should be, let me know if you hear it.
Will you listen me?
Yes?
Yeah, okay. My question is that with the war that is happening in Ukraine and the relations between Russia that provided the European Union lots of fuel and of gases and all that thing, if the objectives are going to be faster in the green transition, or in the other way, it's only like something temporal, because as we can see, the fuel and the gas is continuing going to European Union. And I know that it's a difficult situation because you cut this in one day to another. But I don't know how this is going to repercute in this Green Deal and the transition to a more environmental friendly situation. Thank you.
Okay, did you got the question? I mean, any one of you that wants to start answering? Or Melanie, Teresa?
I can give it a start. So in general, of course, the recent circumstances just, I think what is safe to say is that it is important in our reaction to the current circumstances that we stick with the ambitions in the European Green Deal and not just fuel switch to different energy sources like oil or coal. And in general, the Commission's position that Ursula von der Leyen also said in her speech this month is that in general, the way to go is diversification of gas suppliers, energy efficiency and renewables, and boost the renewable energy targets. So this is what I would be able to repeat, as obviously the EEA doesn't have a political position on that, but aligns with the Commission position.
Thank you very much, Teresa. I don't know if you want to say, you are mute, Teresa. Teresa, you're mute.
Thank you. I think it's a very interesting question, and I'm going to give you some ideas, and I hope that it might be useful for you. Last year, the European Commission proposed a taxonomy, a list of activities that will receive European funds and that are presented to investors as being qualified as the best activities that are going to be in the road for the economic transition. In the last minute, there was this important dispute because of France wanted to keep the nuclear energy and Germany wanted to keep the gas for this transition period. And the truth is that at the end of the day, I mean, this is something very important. And we are talking about the difficulties to reach these targets in the period that we committed. And this is something that is quite important. But it is for sure that in the current circumstances, even though we are going to boost renewables, we will have to accept that the transition is going to be longer and more difficult than we foresaw at the beginning. And given the war, it's going to take more time. And well, we will see. Because I don't know if you have heard about the situation with the Nord Stream project and the Opal system that was going to bring gas to Germany, avoiding the territory of Ukraine, Poland, and the Slovakia. So it is kind of complicated just to consider the geopolitics of energy. So it's true that this Nord Stream and the Opal gasoduct, they are going to be available, but not now. But we will see what happens in the future, because the future is true. We need renewables. We need our autonomy, and we always talk about our in terms of security, and now it's truer than ever. And this is something that we will have to cope with. The other thing is that I think there is a question as well, talking about the European Union and the member states complying with our commitments. And I just wanted to add something that when in the previous, in the pre-conferences and in the assessment process that took place the 5 years after the adoption of the the Paris Agreement, in 2020, in the month of November, during the German presidency of the European Union, Angela Merkel, she presented before the United Nations the data regarding the European Union compliance with the Paris Agreement. And this is something that we really need to remember, that we did it. I mean, we were among those few that comply with the commitments that we accepted in the Paris Agreement. On the other hand, there is a problem because in the Paris Agreement, it was introduced the principle of progression and non-regression. So it means that we need to go further. So this is why we accepted this target of a 55% reduction of our emissions. That is a very important target that became a reference for the United States of America, that accepted a 53% of reduction of their emissions when President Biden took its presidency in the United States of America. The truth is that we are complying all together under this umbrella formula, and we are compensating our different degrees of compliance. In the road to Glasgow, there were some member states that were causing problems. I mean, Poland, Hungary, they were just well, and I will have to say Spain as well. They were complaining about these targets because they knew the social cost of applying all the measures related with the Paris Agreement and the Green Deal. There is a cost for miners, for for the sector of transport, of agriculture, and this is something that the European Union, I think, is finally taken into account, and I think this is important. The social cost is going to be taken into account. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. And don't know if there is any other question in the classroom. No other questions? Any other question on the Zoom room? We have Diego Sanchez, which also, I think, asking about, I don't know if you want to put your own question, Diego? You're mute.
It says the mic is not working, the question.
Okay. Okay, so let me just put, well, there is his question was actually about enforcement and what can, in general terms, I understand citizens do whenever member states are not complying or are in a situation of not complying or not effectively transposing the European Union law that implements the Paris Agreement. So if you want to make a short question, a short answer here. I don't know, I mean, the European Environmental Agency has a very, I mean, small role in terms of compliance, isn't it?
Yeah, we don't have a role in the compliance itself. What we do is measuring progress and delivering evidence for informed decision making. But when it comes to compliance of member states, for example, with their internal targets, or of the EU with the international targets, this is done at the Commission level. And of course, if member states wouldn't comply with their targets, there would be mechanisms to either have an infringement procedure, but on an international level, I'm not entirely sure. I think it's more a legal question.
Yes, yeah, I think so. In fact, the procedures are, well, according to what the treaty has already established, the role of the European Commission and the possibilities that the citizens have in order to make a complaint to the European Commission or through the petitions commissions committee, the petitions committee at the European Parliament, etc. We still have another one, the last question I think it's interesting, which is actually also on the chat concerning this concept of degrowth. The concept of degrowth, and it's Jaume Pujol Ras who asked about this concept and how the energy production and consumption of our economies continues to augment at a level that our renewable energy production cannot sustain. This means remaining dependent on fossil energy sources that are already scarce. Is there anything that you want to say about that concept of degrowth? Yes, please, Melanie.
Yes, we have a very fresh assessment out that is named Growth Without Economic Growth, where we look exactly into the linkage between the increases in production, consumption, and resource use with its effects on the natural environment and also on human health, and that it is for long-lasting to release environmental pressures, it will be necessary to have an absolute decoupling of the economic growth from the environmental pressures. And this is something that is discussed in this new publication. And I will share the link to this publication. It was written by my colleague, so I'm not familiar with all the details. So here is the link.
Okay. Sorry.
So we do dare to look into this.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I don't know if there is any other questions. I think we got all on the chat and in the classroom. Is there no any other questions?
Mar, I will like
Yes, sorry, please. Yes, go on.
Mary, I would like just to add something else. It's just I have discussed degrowth with my students of environmental science for years. And this is something that I try to defend, taking into account the EU's position. And I always talk about the importance of our circular economy strategy. We are trying to change everything. And as Melanie said, everything is based on this idea of decoupling growth from the use of resources. The only way to do it, and we are not talking just about fossil fuels, we are talking about other resources. It means that we are going to invest on recycling, on reducing, and I suppose that the idea of ecological service will become more and more important. And this is something that is also well related with climate change in order to improve, our targets and the way we comply. All these ideas related with the green economy, the circular economy will become more important in the future.
Yeah, okay. Yes, I also so sorry. Okay, so if there is no more question, I think that we are almost on our time right now. Let me just put in front of the camera so at least you can see you. I don't know if you can see me too. Okay, yes. So I would like to thank you very much, our two speakers. We did a big applause. Well, thank you very much to our two speakers, and I think it has been a great session. It was our, well, not the first experience in online seminars, but a first experience for me, online seminar into the classroom with that kind of connection, and I think it worked quite well. So thank you again to Professor Melanie Spoorer from the European Environmental Agency. It was a great pleasure for us having you this afternoon here with us, sharing your time with our students and our also students on the net, and also with Professor Teresa Fajardo. Thank you so much for your time and for your contributions this afternoon with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Ciao.
you.
Thank
See you
you.
soon.
Okay, and all of you, please, I want the list. And thank you very much for your attention. So let me just stop.